Thank you very much, Rick. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Now imagine that you had $1 billion to improve the public schools in your city, or $100 billion to spend. What would you do? Well, if you looked at the research, it would tell you that you shouldn't bother to spend the money on reducing class size. That won't work. That you shouldn't bother to spend the money on more teacher training. That won't work either. You shouldn't bother to spend the money on new curricula because that won't help. And you shouldn't bother to spend the money on new principal training because although it may work, it's almost impossible to scale it up in a way that works. So what would you do? Is there anything that works? Well, what I'm here to talk about is the research that I've done with my team, and I just want to point out that, as Rick Hess said, we did visit every single one of these schools. We interviewed the principal because this is the first study that I can think of, I don't know of another, if you know of one, please let me know, that actually measured the degree of control that a principal has over their school budget. Now, I first did this in the year 2000. I compared the 3 largest school districts, New York, LA, and Chicago, to what at the time were the only 3 districts in North America that were decentralized. And I found that in New York City, I interviewed 66 principals. I sat down with each one. I went through their budget. This is in 2001. And said, now, do you control this item or does the central office control it? Do you control this one? How about this one? And we found that on the average, New York City principals in the year 2001 controlled 6.1% of the money spent in their schools. Today, among the empowered schools that were launched by Eric Nadelstern, the average is they control 85% of the money spent in their schools. And Eric is now responsible for managing all 1,631 schools in New York City, all of which are now being put on this basis. So the question arises, does decentralization work? Well, if you look at the research, it's very difficult to tell. Because there, as I said, there is literally no empirical research in which anyone has actually measured the amount of decision-making authority that principals or schools have. Sometimes they will say this district has decentralized without actually measuring to see if it has. In the famous studies of the Chicago school reform of 1988, it was widely asserted that they had decentralized, and then there are arguments about whether that decentralization improved student performance or did not. But my question is, how do we know that they actually decentralized? Because no one actually took a measure to find out if principals had more decision-making authority after 1988 than they did before. So that's what's interesting about this study. We wanted to know if you actually give principals more decision authority in a competitive setting, one in which parents have free choice of which public school to send their child to, in which there was a dense network of accountability so that the principal's job was on the line if student performance did not respond, in which there was careful selection, training, and support of principals, in which there was a thoughtful application of weighted student formula, in which Checker Finn and his colleagues have made a huge contribution in getting states to think about this. If you had these competitive conditions present, and then you gave the principal the ability to control what went on in their school, what would they do with that freedom? And the answer is, what they do is they overwhelmingly eliminate non-teaching positions and use that money instead to hire more classroom teachers, and then they use their freedom over curriculum, schedule, and staffing mixture to rearrange their instructional program in such a way that they drive down the total student load. Now, imagine in thinking about the meaning of total student load that your teacher were Aristotle. And Aristotle has 25 students. He isn't going to instruct them only in mathematics, or only in science, or only in literature, or only in philosophy, or only in history. He's going to instruct them in all 5 topics. So Aristotle teaches 5 classes a day to 25 students per class, but he only has a total student load of 25. He only has to get to know 25 young human beings. That's the key. As Ted Sizer pointed out in his Horace books, it's clear that what matters is not class size so much as the ability for a student to talk to a teacher in a hallway, in an office hour, to get the kind of encouragement and the kind of direction that makes the difference between giving up and continuing on. So in New York City today, by union contract, the maximum total student load for a teacher in middle or senior high school is 5 classes of 34 students. That's 170. In the Los Angeles Unified, it's 225. In Boston, it's 140. Now, if you have 140 or 170 students, when I was in high school, I wrote papers that were 25 pages long. I wrote a senior thesis that was more than 50. Now, how are you going to read 25-page papers from 140 students and write thoughtful comments on each one, commenting on logical development, paragraph structure, sentence structure, punctuation, spelling, proper citation, proper use of analogy, metaphor, and simile? Well, now the standard paper in high school, of course, is 5 paragraphs because the total student load is far too high for anything else. Now you create a vicious cycle, one in which teachers know that their students are going to fail. Therefore, the teacher is going to fail. Therefore, the teacher wants to get out of the classroom. And that creates pressure within the district to create more non-classroom jobs for credentialed teachers. And as Linda Darling-Hammond has pointed out, across the country, in our schools and school districts, 43% of the employees are non-classroom teachers. So let's take a little bit closer look. In New York City, in the typical school today, although the maximum TSL is 170, the actual for the typical school, if we exclude the non-traditional schools, the special schools, the magnet schools, which have very low TSLs, the TSL runs about 140. In the empowered schools that Eric Nadelstern created, it averages 88. Some of those schools have TSLs up in the range of 95 to 110. That means others of them are in the range of 63, 64, 65. Now let's go back for a moment. Let's suppose now that you're in LA. You have a TSL of 225. Now, if your child should be so lucky as to attend an elite private school anywhere in this country, the typical total student load is 60 to 65 students per teacher. That, in a sense, is the entire difference between public and private. It's 140 or 200 versus 60 to 65. Some of these schools in New York City are now operating in the total student load range of places like Deerfield and Phillips Academies. Now, we know from the research on large companies that when you have a large organization, and I spent most of my career studying very large business organizations, once they're more than 150 professional employees, they're large. They start to show diseconomies of scale. If they have more than 3,000 workers performing repetitive manual tasks, they start to show diseconomies of scale. As Valerie Lee and her co-authors have pointed out, these diseconomies of scale apply to individual schools.